I'm Steve Frishman. I am a geologist. I've worked uh, since 1987 as a technical consultant to the state of Nevada in overseeing the National Nuclear Waste Program that has ended up centered at Yucca Mountain. Uh, Prior to coming to Nevada, I was director of the Texas Nuclear Waste Programs Office, where the government, before they settled on the Nevada site, they were looking at sites around the country. And there were two sites in Texas, so I directed the program that's equivalent to the program here in Nevada. And in 1987, when the law changed and selected Nevada as the only site, then everything else was shut down. I knew the director of the Nevada program, I knew the governor, and they asked me to come and work as a consultant for them. And so I've been here since 1987. I started out being interested in the high-level waste program and the problems when I was appointed to an advisory committee in Texas, where I was the vice president of the Texas Environmental Coalition, and I was appointed to an advisory committee that the state put together to advise the Texas congressional delegation on the writing of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. So I've been involved in this since the very beginning of the national policy effort to do something about high-level waste. So it's pretty much been my whole life.
Steve, may I ask you describe the key point of the Yucca Mountain project? I mean, from the beginning, what was the motivation of the national authorities to promote this project,
Okay.
and what was the information background?
Well, the U.S. government had for a couple decades been looking around the country very quietly, looking for sites. In 1957, the National Academy of Sciences put together a very large meeting where it was thought that salt deposits might be a good place to dispose of waste. And for years, the federal government quietly looked around the country at some of the major salt deposits, and as soon as they got caught by state governments and governors, they got thrown out because they were trying to sneak in, and because they knew they wouldn't be popular, the governors caught them and threw them out. So the basis for the Nuclear Waste Policy Act was to have a national policy so that the government wasn't sneaking around looking for sites that upset people. The reason Yucca Mountain actually became one of the sites is that in 1977, because the government was having a hard time even getting to look at places, the General Accounting Office, which is an advisory panel for the Congress, said, well, maybe you should be looking at atomic energy defense facilities, because those are pretty well accepted where they are. They have somewhat popular because they employ a lot of people, and they've already had issues of contamination. They understand how to deal with radiation. So they said, look at atomic energy defense facilities. And out of that came both the Hanford site in Washington, which is where most of the reactors are that produce plutonium for the weapons program, and also the Nevada test site. So they started looking, they picked a site at Hanford, and they also started looking around the Nevada test site. And there's a lot of different geology at the Nevada test site. They looked at a little piece of granite, and they were mostly just looking at location rather than anything else. We know that for most of the Nevada test site, the water table is very deep. So there's a lot of distance down to the water table. So if you're going to bury stuff deep, it may be attractive. So they looked around the site, and there's some debate about this, but I followed it pretty carefully. And what they did was every place they seemed to stop and get interested, the people in the weapons program said, we have used that so it's contaminated, or we're planning to use it. So they kept getting chased around the test site, and they finally ended up with Yucca Mountain, which is just off the western edge of the Nevada test site, but the access to it is through the test site, or the easiest access. So Yucca Mountain was essentially a default site at the Nevada test site. And they originally were talking about, even though the water table is about 1,000 feet below the top of the mountain, they originally were thinking about looking at below the water table, and then said, well, why would we go so deep? And they said, we have 1,000 feet above the water table. It's very dry. So why don't we think about a repository above the water table, even though nobody had ever thought about it that way before. So it sort of became not only a default site, but also a default technology. And once we had it, regardless of anything that turned up that was that seemed to be slightly adverse, they could always come up with something that said, well, we don't want to lose an otherwise good site, so we'll figure out how to deal with this and how to deal with that. And so it's become a default site, a default technology. And ultimately we figured out the geology just does not work if what you're looking for is geologic isolation of the waste, because the site can't isolate waste.
And what was the position of the opponent of this Yaqui Mountain nuclear site? I mean, information, or it is only emotional aspect?
Well, we, working with the state and geologists of the state and contractors that we had, we very quickly figured out that the rock at Yucca Mountain is very fractured, and which makes the whole site very porous, meaning water is going to run down through the site very quickly. And it doesn't rain a lot, but there's still water. And we'll get some snow on top of Yucca Mountain. So we very quickly came to the position the site was selected as the only site in 1987. By 1989, we knew that the site physically did not work for waste isolation. And in 1989, we explained this to members of the legislature. We explained it to the governor. And the governor actually, because there were Department of Energy siting guidelines, we could cite a guideline that was violated by the site, even though we had enough data to where we could say this site should be disqualified. And so in 1989, the legislature passed a law making it illegal to store high-level waste in the state. So we had established a state policy opposing Yucca Mountain. And in that same year, the governor wrote a letter to the Secretary of Energy citing the regulation and the citing guideline that was violated by Yucca Mountain. And the answer that came back was, well, we're still studying the site. And that this data that you have, and that is data that DOE collected, that we used to try to analyze the site, they just say that's not conclusive, we're still studying the site. And interestingly enough, 10 years later, 1999, the next governor and an incoming governor together wrote essentially the same letter using additional data that we had collected and DOE had collected over the past 10 years, is telling them the same thing. The site should be disqualified, and here's the reason why. And we got the same answer. We're still studying the site. So what it comes down to is an obvious defect in the system, and that's that once you get down to naming only one site, you have no alternatives until you absolutely stop working on that site and just say you're not going to do it anymore. The only incentive is to keep working on it, keep doing it, and there's no way out for a bureaucratic governmental organization as long as they don't have an alternative. And in this case, it turned out that they'll work on it as long as Congress pays. And the way we have gotten to the point now that you understood that President Obama said we're not going to do this anymore. And the way it has been, that position has been implemented is since 2010, Congress has appropriated no money. And the only money that's in the system is the little bit of carryover money at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and at DOE that they didn't spend at the time everything was shut down in 2010. So right now, as long as Congress doesn't appropriate any money, nothing happens. And that's the story of Yucca Mountain at this point.
You are a geologist, and what is your vision, what is your recommendation? Is it possible to isolate Springfield roads from the nature during the old time when it will be dangerous for the nature, and how long time we need to protect?
Well, I guess I wouldn't be in this business at all if I thought that geologic isolation was not possible. So, and I felt ever since the very beginning when I started looking at the Waste Policy Act back in, the 80s. Now, I've thought that there is a pretty good chance that we can find geologic settings that can isolate waste, and for the periods of time necessary, which is essentially the hazardous lifetime of the waste, which could be, the U.S. regulation says you need to be able to, through modeling efforts using good data, you need to be able to demonstrate for about 1 million years, which for Yucca Mountain is not an impossible idea. People are not used to dealing in 1 million years for anything, but looking at things geologically and what we know about the geology, we can make reasonable projections if we understand the geologic processes that are going on and understand the processes that have gone on in the past. So I don't think geologic isolation is impossible. I think we need to, we've learned a lot about the types of settings that we might want to look for, and they're not entirely rare in the world. And in Sweden and Finland, they're on to what I think is a good setting in terms of the combination of features that the site has. It's a site that is hardly fractured at all, doesn't have large fractures. And the fractures in the rock, you're always going to have fractures in rock, but the fractures in the granitic rock are very small and not connected. The water in the rock is there and is hardly moving at all, if it is even moving. You have the water there is one of the things that tells you that it's not moving is the water in the fractures in the rock is so old that it has no oxygen in it. And the reason it has no oxygen is because the oxygen has been consumed in oxidizing minerals. So you don't have a flow-through system. You have a very tight system. You don't have a lot of recharged water because it's not flowing through anything. And you have an anoxic system. And one of the advantages of a system with no oxygen is that most radionuclides are essentially insoluble in an anoxic environment. So you have both physical and chemical protection, which is a pretty good place to start.
You said about 1 million lead for the isolation. Who decided and who estimated in U.S. about this?
The reason for the 1 million years in the regulation in the U.S. is specifically related to Yucca Mountain. In 1982, or 1992, we had an Environmental Protection Agency radiation standard that was a generic standard, and it spoke to allowable releases from a repository. We discovered that Yucca Mountain violated that standard, and it violated it partly because it was above the water table, and we would have very early releases of carbon dioxide that contained carbon-14, the radioactive isotope of carbon. And nobody had anticipated this when the rule was written. So they didn't want to, the Department of Energy didn't want to lose what they called an otherwise good site just because it violated one piece of the standard. So it ended up, after the EPA would not change its standard, the National Academy of Sciences would not recommend that the standard be changed. So the Department of Energy went to Congress and asked to have EPA instructed to write a standard specific to Yucca Mountain. And by the way, get rid of this thing that would be violated. So what the Congress did was they passed an amendment to the Energy Policy Act that told EPA to write a standard specific to Yucca Mountain that would be based not on releases but on doses to individuals from releases. But they also said that the National Academy of Sciences needed to be asked to put together a panel that would look into the technical basis for a repository radiation standard for Yucca Mountain specifically. So out of that panel came an analysis of what DOE knew about Yucca Mountain. And the panel believed, and I think correctly so, that looking at what we and DOE and everybody sort of understood about the geology and hydrology, that it is reasonable to project on a model basis out about 1,000,000 years at Yucca Mountain because of the past, our knowledge of the past geology and geologic processes. It's reasonable to look out about 1,000,000 years at Yucca Mountain. So the reason for the standard is specific to Yucca Mountain, and it's that we, as technical experts, believe that you can project geologic processes and events out about 1,000,000 years in order to sort of test the integrity of the site for isolation of waste. And as I said, we know that it fails that test.
Could you recommend the optimal model of the different stakeholders cooperation, or and who is stakeholders, which is provide the safety repository for the spent fuel rods?
I think, from my perspective, that it's necessary to first do sort of a screening for the places that you don't want to be, meaning not geologic or geographic locations or political locations or anything, just the kind of geology that you don't want to look at. And so it's an exclusionary screening. Once you have laid out the exclusionary features, you could do this globally. And you could say, all right, we're not even going to consider anything there. Then start saying, well, what are the priorities for good, better, and best once you've gotten rid of the ones you know you don't want? And you can start doing a prioritized screening just for geologic settings before you ever go look for where these settings might be. And this is pretty much what appears in International Atomic Energy Agency literature. This is pretty much what they say ought to be the way you start looking for things. And once you know what the priorities are, then go geographically looking for places that have these types of settings. And you don't have to do, because geology is pretty well known in just work that's been done over the last century. You can start looking for places that meet at least these screening criteria. And then on top of that, once you get to places that you think might be worth further look, then you've got to have a societal buy-in. You can't force it on anybody, because all you have to do is start trying to force it on somebody and everybody's going to revolt. So you say, okay, we have these possible sites. Now, is anybody willing for us to look? And look meaning we do a little bit more intrusive study of the site. Not enough to prove that it's a great site or prove that that it's even a good site, but just a look at it to say, well, does it have anything that would immediately tell us we should not be here? So I guess what I'm sort of leading to is my idea of screening is exclusionary screening rather than inclusionary screening. And I think you can build a logic trail if you do it that way. And of course, as I said, you have to have the societal buy-in. Part of the way you get a societal buy-in is if you have a credible process and a believable process. And if people understand and believe that this is a credible and fair process with the type of screening I'm talking about, then some people may be willing to go the next step. Just to say, okay, it's a credible process. Let's go the next step, see if this site has features that would disqualify it or features that make it as good or better than we think we need for waste isolation. So it's got to be sort of a stepwise thing, and you've got to have credibility and believability, and as riding along with all of the technology. You can't do it the way the nuclear industry worldwide has done it all along, which is, trust us, we know everything. Don't worry yourself. We understand it. You don't need to. We'll tell you it's safe, and it is safe. And this led us to things like Chernobyl and Fukushima. And we can't do that with waste disposal because you only get one chance with waste disposal. If it fails, there's no fixing it.
Just now, as I understood, in US you have no any solution for the long-time isolation of the spent fuel rods. What is your point about the idea to export spent fuel rods to another country? Who is responsible for the spent fuel rods?
Well, I think ultimately the Nuclear Waste Policy Act says that the federal government is responsible in the long run. And yes, I've watched the short-lived idea of Russia becoming the global repository. I've watched another company look first at Australia, then South Africa, and I guess the thing that concerns me most is that at least at this stage of our maturity internationally, I still think proliferation is an issue. And I don't think we want to have any one country that has an opportunity to be in charge of all the plutonium in the world. And I just don't think globally we're mature enough for that. And I'd rather we all had our own problems isolating either permanently or in a secure way our own plutonium rather than having one country in charge of all of it when it doesn't mean that I don't trust that country. It's that I don't trust the future. And if you have the world's only stockpile of plutonium, I don't think we are mature enough to believe that it is safe.
Your interview voluntarily used for the distance education course about the decommissioning of the nuclear power plants. It will look at the students in Russia and the United States. I ask you to send message to the students about the nuclear waste, about the nuclear future. What is your, I would say, understanding, like veteran of the nuclear investigations? What is the main topic that's reasonable to know the students?
Okay, yeah.
Just a moment. Just a moment.
Yeah, it's,
Oops.
okay, it was coming from there.
Yeah. Message to students.
Yeah, I think we've had enough experience to have to know a few things. One of them is that in this country especially, and in most other countries that have tried to deal with disposal of their used fuel, is don't be in a big hurry. You know, it's not important to do it right now. What is important is to figure out how to do it safely. And you can't force the issue. We know how to store waste, and we know how to store it pretty safely. And we also know that we can store it under a regulatory system that allows us to keep track of it. A regulatory system that at least can be transparent. That doesn't mean it always is, but it can be transparent. And so we can have some trust and security. And that gives us time to think about how we want to ultimately dispose of this. And so I think the not rushing into it is a key issue. Another is we need to have some type of an institutional system that allows us to deal with a long-term issue. Because even if we had an ideal system for disposal of radioactive waste, it's still going to take us another 25 or 30 years. Even if we had a repository starting today, it's going to take another 25 or 30 years to even load that repository. So we need an institutional system that is not subject to political change and on a regular basis, not subject to just changes if Congress decides, oh, we're spending too much money. So all of a sudden we have to slow down everything just because they want to use that money for something else. And so I've done some thinking through the years because of my experience with originally writing the act, watching the act get cratered for political reasons, which it was, and watching the new act that was Yucca Mountain waste a lot of time and money. One of the things I've thought about is what type of an institutional structure do we need that can take us from the time a reactor stops, which doesn't mean that it has to run a lifetime with all kinds of extensions, but any time a reactor stops, what institution can handle the issue of spent fuel from there to permanent disposal? And what it looks to me like, and I've never been able to get anybody to think hard about this, but we looked at it 15, 20 years ago and sort of came to the idea that an institution that would take over the reactor when it stops, meaning would be an institution that would be in charge of decommissioning through disposal, that may have a future. Because what you would do is, in this country, every reactor that's running has to feed money into a decommissioning fund. And that money is nominally enough to decommission the reactor. We know it isn't, but nominally, according to the rules, it is. So if the institution, whatever it was, something that is at least sanctioned by the government, it doesn't have to be a government agency, but something sanctioned by the government, takes over the decommissioning funds and the closed reactor, manages both the storage, decommissioning, and a waste program as a single institutional unit, and is financed by not only the decommissioning funds, but also, as we have it now, a nuclear waste fund, which is money generated by the generation of electricity from nuclear power plants. And I think that would give at least the possibility of the long view of what to do when the people who generate electricity at nuclear power plants have no incentive to do anything but make money on generating. They have no interest in decommissioning. And so you need somebody or an institution or organization that is interested in the real back end of the fuel cycle, which is when you stop making electricity at the reactor. So this is just an idea, and I would encourage people who are coming after me. I'm almost done with my business here. Yeah, I've done 35 years worth. But people who are coming after my generation, I think aside from the safety issues and the just social acceptability and trust, the institutional issue is going to be the big one, because nobody is used to dealing with institutional problems that go on for decades and need a commitment for decades to continue doing something that you think is right and that you have good reason to believe is right, and also you're flexible enough to where if you have little problems, you can adapt on the way. If you have a big problem, you have enough courage to stop and rethink.
Brilliant. And we want to discuss how to provide new understanding and maybe new international legislation or international convention which is provide the international standards for the decommissioning. What do you think? Is it interesting for you, and is it reasonable to do?
Yes, and I think internationally, we've had enough failures to where at least some of us around the world are thinking about why did these things fail, and is there really some new thinking that we can do that's sort of outside of the pressures that are on the industry right now, because the nuclear industry ultimately is not going to succeed. And so we're going to be seeing a lot of discomfort about decommissioning and a growing discomfort about the waste that decommissioning leaves behind. So yeah, I think it's time for people to be able to think a new way. And that new way means that we're the incentive to just run the reactor and make money is diminishing as the incentive for public safety and welfare and well-being is growing. So yeah, I think it's a good idea, and I think people are ready for it.
You are ready?
I'm ready.
Thank you. Wonderful. Brilliant interview. Yes, please.
At this point, I think in the United States, we need new legislation. But I think there's a big dilemma about what that legislation can be. You know, with the Blue Ribbon Commission that President Obama put together and through the Secretary of Energy, came up with some good general thinking and came up with a couple necessary principles. The key one that they understood, which most other countries in the world have figured out after failures like ours, and that's that you have to have a voluntary system of some kind. You can't force this on anybody. So legislation has to understand that. Legislation also has to understand the longevity of the problem. So you don't get into this situation where next year there's either going to be money or not, and it's always sort of a question of how much money, because the implementer always wants more money than the giver is willing to give. And then, as we were talking before, the institutional issue has got to be resolved. And it's got to be resolved in a way where if we have a well thought out program, it can go to the point of either giving a good indication of success or giving us an indication that we got to stop and rethink. We can't do a year to year. And at this point, I don't think we're mature enough to write new legislation. I think we're going to have to sit for a while and understand the mistakes we've made, not only in this country, but in other countries. And before we, take urgent action once again. And as I said before, we know how to store this stuff. There's nothing that is an imperative to move it or get it underground. Store it, and let's sort of let the political heat die down a little bit. And maybe we can make some good decisions if we're not being driven by an industry that only wants to get this liability out of their backyard so they can make more money. Because I think, as I said, I think those days are sort of going away anyway, and people are seeing through it. So at this point, I think new legislation would probably be precipitous, meaning it would cause new problems that we don't know how to solve. So my feeling is to relax and store and do things as you're suggesting. Get some new minds thinking about how to deal with this that aren't locked into the run the reactor into the ground and dam the waste.
And maybe reasonable now to think not only about the institutionalization of this problem, not only in the US, but in general for the country who have nuclear industry.
Right, the IAEA has done.
May I ask you to move a little? Еще можно.
The IAEA has done a pretty good job at focusing on safety issues. And internationally, everyone has pretty well bought into the general safety issues dealing with waste. And but I think we need some new thinking on the social side of it. How do we? Okay, we all understand safety is paramount, but if you're not going to have an organization or a mindset that allows for that to happen, then we're wasting our time. So I think we need to, maybe not even in a greatly organized way, but we need to internationally come to sort of a set of values that goes along with the safety set of values and a social set of values. And if those two can work together, I think that may take us where we need to go. And so far, the value side of it has been run over by almost every country.
So we need new philosophy of this, how
Cor-
to find
correct.
this. And we need international standards, not only technological but public participation standards. And we need
Right, and
harmony with the social.
right, and you know, there's a Swedish group that quite a few years ago explored this whole idea of intergenerational equity. You know, what responsibilities do we have to future generations? And nuclear waste is a big thing in that consideration. And they did some very good thinking in terms of what responsibilities do we have to future generations. And again, it's not just the safety; it's the philosophy. And we have it, you know, we have it sort of simply. Everybody, I guess, pretty well buys into the fact that we shouldn't burden the future generations with risks that we're not willing to take. But that's not very deep thinking. We need much deeper thinking about what we are passing on to future generations that the nuclear industry has brought us for that, you know, maybe more than we can possibly deal with, but we have to deal with it in some way.